Okay. What was your impressions as you went to Selby's, and what was Raffles like?
Well, to give you an idea of how we felt about the place, we called it Shangri-La. It was a lovely spot. It was on the Ohio River. It had beautiful pastures, nicely kept grass that kept them clipped. And at that time, of course, I wasn't used to board fences. And I was used to walking barbed wire fences, and to get on a place that had nice board fences and that were well kept, Jimmy had several men working there all the time. And it was a beautiful place. Mr. Selby had a very nice home. And Raffles was something new to my experience. Now you have to remember, at that time I was a polo player. And polo players ride 15-hand horses. And here's a little horse, barely over 13 hands, and I didn't know what he was good for. But I loved Image. Image was a real flashy, old moving horse. And there was another horse there that I saw ridden. And after I saw him ridden, I knew that was the kind of horse I was going to raise. The horse that sold me on raising Arabian horses was Stomia. One of the most graceful horses under saddle I've ever seen. He was a lovely horse. It's a shame that we don't have Stomia horses in this country today, because he should have been used. He did go up to Mr. Selby's or Mr. Geym's in later years, and I don't really know if you can find a horse in a pedigree a horse that is descended from any of the mares that bred to him. I just don't recall any, but it's too bad. I learned to appreciate Raffles. I don't remember how many years after I got acquainted with the Selby program, probably 3 or 4 years, when all of a sudden I realized the very best horses that were being produced at Selby's were the Raffles horses. And once I learned that, I learned it well, and I kept it learned. They were the best horses.
Raffles is unique among the Scaronic sons, of course, because he was 75% Scaronic, breeding the horse back to his daughter Ragala. To me, judging from as much as I can tell about Ragala from her photos, Raffles was almost more like her than he was like his sire. Ragala's dam Risla is in Raffles. This is something to, Raffles was 75% Scaronic, but he's also 25% Risla. And that links up with other things, Risla being tremendously influential in almost all Cravat-influenced pedigrees, and ties up when Raffles is crossed to Abu Farwa, when Raffles is crossed to the Rosanthus line, when Raffles goes to, of course, Rislick's breeding, to other modern Cravat lines. When you cross those horses to Russian breeding, Risla comes back again and again. And the thing about Risla, which is fascinating, is that you can't seem to get too much of her, unlike some lines. This is Risala, out of a Romanian granddaughter, who was the only breeding offspring. That's how it worked. Good. Risala was out of Rida, who also produced some important horses by Astrolid. Rida was the only breeding offspring of Mirzuk, one of the Alipash Sharif stallions that was exported to Africa pretty soon after he got to Cravat. And there is quite a distinctive stamp, of course, that breeds down from that. But her dam came here, was the most important foundation mare of Orton stud. He owned two of the most important blunt mares, Rosa Shereyn and Gazala, although.
When my dad first became interested in Arabians, it was through his visits to Cravat Park in England. Of course, visiting with Lady Wentworth the first time or two were very formal, and horses were brought out and shown to you in the courtyard. You were never allowed to go in the barns. Somehow that didn't quite please my father. He always had the feeling that what he really wanted to find out was what the best she had to offer, and somehow he felt that that was what she was not showing him. So he spent a number of visits over the next 2 years just getting the confidence of Lady Wentworth and sitting in the courtyard and having tea and talking, till one day she had a telephone call and was called away, and he snuck into the barn to see what was there. Of course, there were a number of horses that hadn't been shown to him, but the one that impressed him the most was this little white horse, this almost perfect specimen of an Arabian in miniature size, and that turned out to be Raffles. The barn had a long aisle with stalls on either side, and as I remember, there was a stallion, an imported stallion in each one of those stalls. But the one that I had the most fun with and was the most impressive was Raffles. He was in the stall at the very far end, and you couldn't even see him over the top because the stall doors and the stall walls were quite high. They were made of tile, and they came up almost to my chin, and they came up over Raffles' ears. You couldn't tell that there was a horse in there. But I knew there was one in there because he was a dynamic spirit. You could tell, you could sense that there was something in there that wanted to get out. And when you opened the door, there was this beautiful white creature that was perfectly formed and very idealistically, I guess he was an artist's concept of what a horse ought to be, and he was bursting to get out. In fact, George Ford Morris, who was probably the outstanding artist of horses at that time, said of Raffles that he had never seen an animal that had as beautiful and balanced and outstanding a trot. Everybody knew that they could canter on for hours on end in the desert, but nobody knew that they could trot that beautifully and use their body that flexibly. And he thought that that characteristic, if none other, ought to be passed on to future generations of Arabian horses.
A friend of mine was the manager of the mare department to Selby Stud. Mr. Selby had one of the best, really the top herd of saddle horses. I went up and talked to him and told him that I'd like to have a job until things kind of settled down. And I went up there to train and show the saddle horses. Mr. Selby just had the Arabians for his own pleasure. They weren't doing anything with them. I learned a lot from reading the history of the early cattle, the Herefords and the Angus, and also from my grandfathers in breeding horses. And then I had a good fortune to be on a close friendship basis with a number of veterinarians. What little breeding I've done, I've tried to adhere to some very strict standards in it, and disposition is right at the top of the list. The first and most important of it is the soundness of the horse, and the correctness of the horse. And then be very careful and very selective and keep only the best ones.
Lady Wentworth had a way of pricing horses and selling horses. If you wanted to buy a group of horses and she put a price on them that you thought were too high, rather than to lower the price, she'd just throw in an extra horse or two, and you either took them or you didn't get what you wanted. And on this particular occasion, she threw Raffles in, and he was around 8 years old at that time and had not been able to produce any offspring.
He had been sent to the Royal Veterinary College in London and pronounced hopelessly sterile. And when he came over here, Mr. Selby sent him up to Ohio State to see if they could determine what his problem was, but they were never able to. Their conclusion at the end of there was that he was hopelessly sterile. The horse would breed a mare, but he had only seminal fluid. There was no sperm.
The trainers that were at Selby Stud before I was there tried to make a saddle horse out of Raffles, but the training methods used by the saddle horses in this country were not the same way that you handle Arabians, because Arabians would fight back if you tried to force train them. My wife and I started to work with him to try to get him gentled down so that he would be some usefulness to the establishment. And also I had him examined, and there was nothing pathologically wrong with him that he shouldn't be able to sire foals. So we started on this program of trying to quiet him down and give him exercise. And
we would just play with him and feed him apples and carrots. And finally, we got to the point where we decided that we'd try to ride him. Well, I led him and told her to walk right behind me and put her hand on his back while she was walking, and we got to the point where I put my hand back and she stepped up in it, slid over on his back, and he went right straight up in the air. She just put her arms around his neck and patted him and talked to him, and he walked 2 or 3 steps on his hind legs, and then he just come down and go up, come down and go up. And she just kept talking and patting him. We went through that rigmarole for a couple of weeks. Right behind the farm was a large acreage of Forest Service land. It had fire trails all around through it. After breakfast was over in the morning, she would get on him and go into that forest preserve and sometimes ride him clear up till dark. All day she'd take her lunch with her.
then along in the spring, after we'd been riding him some, I bred him to a couple of pony mares, and he settled those. And then afterwards, I bred 2 Arabian mares, and his first foals were born when he was 10, 11 years old. And at one time after that, several years later, he had more registered progeny in the stud books than any other stallion.
Their heads were shorter and wider, and they had more of a dish in them, and they had more animation and more presence than the majority of the other foals did. Everybody that came noticed and wanted to know if that was a different strain of Arabians. It was the scleronic influence that made the difference in them. So I built this frame around him and then put this sling on him and put him inside of that. We had pulleys on it so that every hour I would let him down and take the pressure off of his belly and chest in order that there wouldn't be any accumulation of fluid. And two things that we were worried about besides the healing of the bone was pneumonia and colic. From that time on until we turned him out, there was never a minute there wasn't somebody in that stall with him. We slept right in the stall in front of him where I could put my hand on him. Had him in there from in January until April.
In 1949, after weeks of negotiation, Selby agreed to sell Raffles to Alice Payne, who had wanted him for a long time. However, there was a stipulation. Jimmy had to accompany Raffles to his new home in California and breed him to one mare. The Deans outfitted a special Pullman Railroad car, a Palace Arms. Jimmy, Thelma, and John Payne, Alice's husband, loaded Raffles, a Raffles daughter, and his son, Raffy. Thelma was determined to make the trip in the boxcar with Raffles, but women were only allowed to ride in the passenger cars. Undaunted, Thelma sneaked aboard the boxcar and hid beneath Raffles' belly, concealed behind 10 carefully placed bales of hay. About 20 minutes after the train got underway,
She come out dusting the hay off of her. Every time we'd have to stop and take water, and she'd get back under there, and she rode that all the way to California.
they arrived in California in 5 days, on Thanksgiving, where Alice Payne had an engine waiting to take the railroad car to a point near her farm in Whittier. As soon as the mare was bred at the Paynes, they returned to Selby's, packed up, and moved their Arabians Imogita, Fela, and Argita home to Worthville, Kentucky. Although Alice Payne resisted Jimmy's advice to breed Raffles to Racine daughters, she did breed Raffles to Thelma's mare Fela to produce Fleeta, nicknamed Potty Girl, one of the Dean's Foundation mares.
First generation of Raffles offspring was always as large as them. I don't recall his producing any mares or studs that were smaller than the mares they were out of. Horses like Indra and Carl Asmus, good Rat Mears horse, that was a big, stout horse. He was a national champion horse at the Old National Stallion Show at Waterloo, Iowa. And, I could go on and on. Good, stout, good looking, useful horses. It wasn't until we got down to the second and third generation of inbreeding and line breeding that we started getting those real small horses. This is what happened to Alice Payne's horses. And nobody has learned yet today how to breed the Alice Payne horses without producing those tiny little horses, particularly the stallions. Stallions were always smaller than mares. And we always had trouble with it. We produced colts that were just too small to be used for anything. The fillies were generally quite a lot bigger than the colts. And this went on until Windraff came along. And when Windraff happened, he just didn't carry that small gene. So we've been able to steadily increase our size with the Windraff sons and grandsons ever since Windraff happened. If Windraff hadn't been born, we would have been through. Our line breeding program would have been through. Now I want to go on record for that because that's the way it was. It's the truth of it. And I had foreseen what was going to happen because of Alice's program. She had a very narrow genetic base because she used the daughters of Raffles, who was by Raffles. Then she bred the Raffles daughter Raffles back to Raffles and produced Raffleda, Prochi, and Afera. And then she bred Afera to Raffles and produced Celeste. Now that was her broodmare band. She had a daughter of Raffles, 3 granddaughters of Raffles who was out of the daughter of Raffles, and then another daughter of Raffles who was out of a granddaughter of Raffles who was out of a daughter of Raffles, if you follow me. I mean, these horses were really inbred. And then she bred the fillies from those mares to sons of those mares. And the resulting offspring were tiny little horses, very tiny, but very tiny. And there was no way in the world she could increase the size of those horses because she didn't have enough numbers and she didn't have variation enough in her genetic base to get variations to choose from, to select from. But we tried to get around this by using 6 different mare lines so that we would have a wider genetic base. And so far it's working, it's saving us.
Many of the Raffles lines that you think of as coming from the Selby study, if you go down, they went to California mare lines that were Kellogg or very strong to Kellogg. Quite interesting. So we're going to see some Raffles offspring here. This was his youngest son, Sotep, out of a Zarif daughter, who was out of a Racine daughter. So there's an outcross Egyptian, outcross Davenport on the bottom line, but it's also Raffles crossed back to Racine. Again, I said yesterday, it's hard to get pictures of hen raffs, so I'm really glad. I should again have mentioned yesterday, this Northwest presentation would have had about half as many pictures as it did if Cliff Wilhelmsen had loaned us a collection of old magazines that had this picture among others in it. I think they're in here too. Again, hen raff, out of a Hanad daughter, and showing the very strong Davenport influence which he bred on in some of his line as well. A tremendous mare sire of this horse. And if history had been a little different, probably would have, he had some fine sons that would have done stronger male lines. A little different stamp of horse, again, more Risla and another line to her 3/4 brother Ribal on the bottom. This is Raffi by Raffles out of Imagita. There was, of course, a famous family of horses from that cross. Several grays, one bay and one chestnut. The grays, very similar. I knew the two, Gita and Raf Gita, full sisters very well. They were just feminine versions of this. Very refined horses. Here's the bay brother Imarab. Much more like Raffles, even though he's bay and the others were gray. Another interesting thing which I should mention is Raffles carried the Scaronic bay gene, which we always think Scaronic as he was, a homozygous gray horse. But there's a bay gene comes in there. And this is a bay horse carrying that gene since he's crossed a chestnut. The Raffles story would not have happened, of course, without Jimmy Dean. So here's Jimmy Dean with the inbred Raffles son, Raffi, whose second dam was Karema by Nassim. So this was one of the handful of highest percentage Scabronic horses ever bred. Yes? Okay, the first one we had, the very light spare horse was RAFFI out of Vegeta. This very substantial horse is RAFFEY, the inbred Raffles' son. And this was Jimmy Dean's head stallion for many years, as is appropriate, since Jimmy Dean would have to have the highest percentage Quranic stallion, or nobody else could, surely. Tremendous. Okay, this is Geym, a full three-quarter brother to Ratby, with the Mirage influence, since his dad, of course, was by Mirage out of Karema. They're alike and they're different. And this was the only stallion by Raffles out of a Mirage daughter that lived to grow up. And he, in turn, became the head sire at the Selby stud, because if anybody was going to have a Raffles son out of a Mirage daughter, it had to be Selby stud. This is Jimmy Wrench's stallion, Ragala, who was a full brother to Hanraff that we talked about, by Raffles out of a Hanad daughter. And I'm glad to get a chance to talk about Jimmy Wrench, because I think I learned about him very late in life, and I expect if I ran into him that late in the game, many people have never heard of him at all. And he was very well known in a very quiet way. He used desert influences and Skoronic, a follower of both Raswan and of the Skoronic breeding, which is not your standard pattern, really. This is Indy, out of a non-Skoronic mare in Dea, who was full brother to Indian Magic's dam. And I think in this horse you see a little more resemblance to Indian Magic than you do in his brother Indraf. This was the first Raffles son in the stud book, and he is very widespread in pedigrees. Of course, he was the foundation stallion of Almara, and their whole program was built around him. RJ and I have an ongoing discussion about the historical period when you had to have one sire, and there was one sire, and you did that sire. And if your mares didn't cross with him, they went down the road, and then you inbred that sire, and so on. And that was a historical period. I don't think anyone did that on purpose, although certainly among other people, Jimmy Dean had tremendous influence on putting that idea about. But that was also done at the King Ranch, and that's how they founded the King Ranch quarter horses and the son of Gertrudis cattle. And so that was a historical phase in livestock breeding. But Indra is also, for example, he's the sire of Gazon's dam, and Gazon was bred to an Indraf daughter to get Raffon and Gazraf and Gabadraf and a whole string of important horses. So he's very widespread, not only in Almara pedigrees or directly influenced Almara pedigrees. This is Raffles bred to a full sister to Indraf and Indy. This is Rapture. Again, the Skoronic bay, even though the bay crappet mare was on the bottom, Rafflo was chestnut. This, of course, was another important sire for R.B. Field in the Northwest, then went to Almara, and then went to Xanadu in Wisconsin. Arif, Raffles out of the straight Mainsboro mare, Ara, was one of a string of really stunning full siblings bred by the Tormolans at Ben-Hur. Another one is Arath, and this is one of my favorite illustrations of the Risla coming back out. Again, Ara was by a son of Rival, who was three-quarter brother to Risla, and her dam was by Rizvan, so this thing just sort of made a little pyramid and popped back out in this line of breeding. Arath was bred to another of those full siblings, where he was bred repeatedly to both of his full sisters, Aratha and Arafla. And of course, this is the most famous product of that. This is Louisfield Sun God, who unfortunately was badly foundered as a young horse, didn't have as many foals as we'd like to have seen. But that, in the direction that was going of those Ben-Hur, Raffles, Ara horses, not surprisingly, since this is all he is inbred on that, is probably the ultimate expression of it. And it was certainly one of the lovely horses of his day. This, I did check the markings. This is Sheikh, not Shayar. Again, part of the Northwest presentation, but also a Raffles son. This cross, Raffles on a daughter of the desert-bred stallion Saud out of Davenport mare. And since Charles is here, that mare, yes, had a line of Domel, so she wasn't straight Davenport. Was one of the really important crosses at the Selby stud. And her daughter, Rathbara, then went on to be to found the most important family for Alice Payne's Asseal Arabians, where of course Raffles was inbred with some racine and intensely scleronic horses bred. Coming out with horses sometimes look quite a lot like this. Cassandra was a very famous daughter of Raffles. Most of her foals were by rapture. She also had Jemima by hand wrap, and then in her old age she went to Almara and was bred to Almara Redanas. I believe Shalimar gave us several other horses there. Raffles out of a Mirage granddaughter out of the Egyptian mare Rhoda, who was by the same sire as Nazir. I like to, and since I talked about the dams, I also like to remember that there are daughters of stallions as well as sons, but it's a lot easier to get pictures of the stallions because they're advertised as stud all the time. Azraf by Raffles out of Azjapur, and an interesting concept which RJ introduced me to is that Azjapur was not really a Polish mare because she has no Polish traditional founder animals in her pedigree. She is has Lyle and Marva and I think some Babylon and other European sources, but she was not actually of Polish breeding, even though Henry Babson bought her in Poland. And this, of course, has been a tremendously influential stallion, probably the most influential Raffles son, especially as a sire line, and combining with the Verzon horses, and you can see the similarities and the differences, how that would be a logical kind of combination that someone would try and see why it would work.